This is the second year that we have done the showcase. It has been a sort of a replacement for the celebration of student achievement just for the political science department. I kind of like it because it gives us a little bit more flexibility of what research we want to present and how. We needed that flexibility this year because being remote only, we unfortunately don't get to be in the lobby of the social sciences building or the education building, drinking lukewarm coffee and eating donuts. But we do get to still see exciting research that's in progress. And the research today that we're going to see is from my political communication 498 senior seminar. So all these projects are about political communication, sort of loosely defined. And we're going to hear about 3 projects today from seniors in the class. I'll introduce them as they come up. Each speaker is going to speak for about 10 minutes, and there will be time for questions afterwards. I'll probably ask the first question. If you would like to ask a question, please, in the participant tab, please click the blue raise hand function button, and I will call on you. I have the waiting room on so that we don't get Zoom bombed. So I'll have my eye over there, and I'll try to be admitting people as they want to come in. So each presentation will be about 10 minutes. We'll have time for about 3 to 5 minutes of questions afterwards, and we should wrap up by about 12:15. Our first presentation today is going to be from Alana Namit. Alana, how should I say your last name? And
it's Namit.
Namit. I thought I had it right the first time. And her topic is going to be about activist athletes in the age of Black Lives Matter. So whenever you're ready, Alana, you can go ahead.
Okay. Okay, so as Dr. Garlick said, my presentation is about athletes and politics. It's a study into Black Lives Matter and athletic activism. Okay, so what sparked my interest in this was that the athlete's role in society is expanding from the entertainment sector to the political sector, as seen by Jackie Robinson, Tommy Smith, and John Carlos. And it's not a very new trend, as seen by these athletes. So my question is, why do athletes receive different responses and consequences from the public after their protest? And my answer to this was that it's the composition of the fan base that causes athletes to be treated differently after they take part in these protests, more specifically the sports ideology and the diversity of the fan base. So quick literature review. So Pryor established in his text that viewership for news diminished as entertainment and the sports sector expanded, so which leads to some people to believe that politics is being taken over by the entertainment industry. And this is seen by political scientists like Larkin, who believe it's being taken over, and it's the power of the soft news which is dominating the entire news sector. And then on the other side of the argument is Thrall, who believes that celebrities don't actually hold the power in politics. It's just an increased trend for celebrity involvement. So instead of the entertainment industry going into the political sector, it's more like politics are being brought into the sports industry. Similar, Dresner believed that there's new reasons to get involved for athletes, such as establishing a brand, increased autonomy. It's a way to distinguish themselves from other celebrities. For my paper in particular, Earnhardt said that there's a rise of sport identity, which is a set of values for a region or a type of group, and it creates this bond for all these different people around the country or in a specific region. And then in addition, Black Lives Matter has been amplified since the evolution of technology. So the constant 24/7 coverage allows for athletes to get involved on any platform, and it helped raise Black Lives Matter to be one of the most prominent current social movements. Okay, so my theory is that mass media and technology has allowed celebrities to make their political beliefs more public. There is evidence of statistically that there's a constant increase of activism, and to be quite honest, political science sort of neglect the athletic industry, considering that there's such a high self-identification. There should be some more studies done into this. Um, my theory is that when an athlete goes against the values of those who self-identify with them, they will face greater consequences. Similarly, it's that a movement that follows values that a group likes will most likely have a more positive response and less backlash. The variables that I will focus with are racial demographic and how the racial demographic leads to the amount of attention that um, an athlete will receive for their political activism, and as well as the political ideology of the fan base will lead to the amount of backlash or the type of backlash that a athlete will receive. So, just a quick summary of this. I received my data from a variety of sources. The only source that is held constant throughout all athletes and sports is the political ideology section, which is the Scarborough Research Politics of Fans, which it lists sports on Republican and Democratic skew, and it's held constant throughout the study. Everything else is a combination of other work. Okay, so this is the 2x2 table that I worked with, and it's Bubba Wallace will represent the group of a white fan racial demographic and a conservative ideology following. Serena Williams of the WTA will represent a white fan base with a liberal ideology. Colin Kaepernick with the NFL will represent a diverse and conservative ideology, and LeBron James of the NBA will represent a diverse group, diverse racial demographic, and liberal ideology. Okay, so in order to understand how controversial Black Lives Matter is and how it can be perceived differently based on ideology and race, I used these two polls, and the Wall Street Journal found that 30% found it very positive and 30% found it very negative, which shows that there's equally strong feelings from groups. And for the point of this study, it's the very positive will probably be considered the liberal ideology, whereas the very negative will probably be considered the conservative ideology. And another study was PBS NewsHour and NPR, and again, 54% found it favorable and 40% found it unfavorable. Okay, so this is the chart that I was talking about. This is the Scarborough Research Report, and for the purpose of the study, I will not be focusing on how Republican and how Democratic it is, rather where they lie on the chart. And for this, you find that the WTA and the NBA are on the Democratic, or which will be the liberal side, and the NFL and NASCAR will be on the Republican side, or the conservative ideology for the purpose of the study. Okay, so NASCAR and Bubba Wallace. So I briefly go over what each player did in my paper, but I'm just going to go over the results, which are Bubba Wallace received low attention and high backlash. I conducted a study of associating an athlete with with Black Lives Matter, and I found that he received 1,846 results. And considering that they have a fan base of 75 million viewers, it doesn't really seem like that high of a value. Now, in regards to the backlash, he received a very high amount of backlash. There was recently a FBI investigation about a noose that was found in his stall in his race car stall. It turns out it wasn't his, but it blew up on social media. Mike Fulp, who is a North Carolina racetrack owner, was found posting this saying, "Buy your Bubba rope today for only $9.99 each. They come with a lifetime warranty and work great." So just the fact that a racetrack owner is so willing to create this kind of speech shows how harsh of a backlash that he was receiving, not to mention that there were protests and death threats from fans. Next up is the WTA and Serena Williams. She received, Serena Williams is one of the most famous athletes in the world. And as you see in the table above, their fan base is around 79.8% white. The other fan base for NASCAR was around 94% white. So that's where the attention aspect comes in. And in the Newsbank search for her, only 405 results showed up, and of 700 million fans, that shows even smaller amount of attention. Her protest was more done through social media and a partnership with the Equal Justice Initiative, where she posted on several social media fronts. And her backlash was so little. There was a controversial tweet that was thought to belong to her, and the internet and her fans quickly defended her, saying it couldn't have been her. And she even became a symbol of Black women, often being cited by many notable Black figures in the community. Next up is NFL and Colin Kaepernick. He, in my opinion, received the highest amount of backlash. He has a very diverse fan base of Asian Americans, Black and African Americans, Hispanics, and white people. The most popular fan base is the Black and African American group. For the Newsbank results, he received 2,500 results within the first year and is now at 8,251 since 2016. They have a current fan base of around 400 million fans. Most notably, he has received a lot of political attention. So he received understanding from Obama, but was ripped apart by President Trump. In a Seton Hall poll, he had a 44% disapproval rate. And in another poll, he was explicitly listed as a reason for increased disinterest in the sport. As many people know, he is no longer playing in the sport, and there's many suspicions that he was actually blacklisted from the NFL unofficially. And controversially, he was excluded from the Madden game for that season, which is currently receiving a lot of attention. Okay. So the next up is the NBA and LeBron James. So the NBA has a very diverse fan base as well, as you could see from the chart up above. And they have around 400 million fans. And for their Newsbank research, he had around 2,186 results in 2020. President Obama praised him for his actions and has kind of used him as a representative for the NBA. President Trump, on the other hand, has once again ripped him apart, saying stick to sports. The NBA has listed him as without a doubt its most impactful voice, and he has become a face of the NBA and NBA's partnership with Black Lives Matter. Okay, so this is just how my results turned out. Bubba Wallace received a low amount of attention with high backlash. Kaepernick received a high amount of attention and high backlash. Serena Williams received a low attention and low backlash, and LeBron James received high attention and high backlash. So just alternative explanations and implications of this. So one thing that can be said is that the number of fans can impact attention. Bubba Wallace had 70 million, whereas Serena Williams had 700 million, but this still applies, and I'll go over that later. And the timing of the protest. So it's become sort of normalized for athletes to protest, and in which Kaepernick did not really have that pleasure. But again, it still applies. So my argument is that sports organizations and athletes are not stuck in one box, and they evolve with politics. So the NFL now can probably be where the NBA is, rather than where the NFL was with Kaepernick. And Wallace may encourage increased liberal involvement, which may move them to the WTA's position. So it's a constantly evolving study. That's it.
Great. Thank you, Alana. So for those of you that are in my usual class, you know that at this point, I usually mandate a number of questions from the audience. Since we're moving quickly today, I'm not going to mandate questions, but if anyone has a question, please either use the raise hand function in Zoom, or you can type it right in the chat and I can relay your question as well, since you're all muted by default. I will ask the first question. And so Alana, your study really, it seems to show that the audience really matters in terms of the public perception of these public figures. And most of the research that we've covered in political communication this semester usually talks about a more top-down kind of model where like the outlets matter or the decisions made or what political elites say matters. So why do you think that audience is particularly important in this case, that mixes politics and entertainment?
Mhm. So I personally think, as Larkin was saying, the power of soft news. Soft news has truly transformed the way that um, that the people in the world receive their news and keep up to date with it. So it's no longer about top down. It's people are, because of social media and 24/7 coverage, people are now on this sort of equal basis, and I think that's why it's truly changed how um, the audience, like the power the audience has. Now they're no longer last minute to hear everything.
Good. For our next question, I'm going to throw it to Professor Dan Bowen from the Political Science Department.
Hi, Alana.
Hi, Dr. Garlick.
Okay, I'm a little confused about the causal story. So walk me through what are your independent variables and what exactly are your dependent variables here?
So my independent variables are my independent variables are one second, sorry, I have it all written down here. It's the racial demographic of the fan base and the political ideology of the fan base. And these two lead to the amount of attention that an athlete will receive and the amount of and the type of backlash and amount of backlash.
Okay, so you have two independent variables and two dependent variables.
Yes.
And what's the causal story that links your independent variables? I mean, what's the explanation? Why does racial demographics of the fan base matter for attention and backlash, and why does ideology of the fan base matter for attention and backlash?
So I think
what's the logic?
I think it goes back to what Dr. Garlick asked me. I believe now the way that the public has power over the news outlet and just politics in general, not direct power, but they have with social media, they have the power to really influence other people's decisions and really get involved. So my idea is that the fan base are the direct source to these athletes, or they make up the power of the athletes in general. So when an athlete goes against what their fan base makes, then they will instantly or most likely have a response from them. Most likely it will be negative response and harsh backlash. So my argument is that the fan base is what makes the organization so powerful. And that is the institution that has, I guess, all the power in the sense. It's not the athletes who have the power in the situation. It's not the sports owners. It's not sports journalists. It's the fan base in general.
Okay, thank you. Alana, there's one more question in the chat that Josh put there. We have to move on to the next topic. So I was wondering if you could just respond to Josh in the chat. His questions about the increasing racial diversity in the United States. All right, so thank you very much. Our next presentation is from Maddie Davies, and it's going to be about the relationship of partisan media in the US and the UK and climate change. So Maddie, hopefully you can unmute and share your screen, and we are ready when you are.
All right. You guys can hear me okay? Good. Awesome. One sec. Okay. Can you guys see my screen okay? Good. Wait. I just can't see you guys. Okay. Sorry. All right. So here we go. One sec. All right. So my research project I conducted was on climate change news and partisan media, specifically looking at whether biased reporting on climate change influences climate change opinions across party lines. And when I first started this research, I was only focusing on the US and how stark media differences in the United States affects party polarization, and specifically looking at the polarization of climate change opinions between Republicans and Democrats. But upon further research and discussing more with Professor Garlick, it was realized that what was necessary was bringing in another entity and bringing in another case in order to prove or disprove the validity of this relationship. Hence why I created a paired case study of the United States and the United Kingdom. So again, utilizing the cases of the United States and the United Kingdom, my goal was to uncover whether polarized majority parties in both countries, obviously in the United States being the Republicans and Democrats, and in the United Kingdom being the Conservative Party and the Labour Party, and whether they are influenced by their respective partisan news sources. And I will go into what those news sources are later on. And again, this research is specifically honing in on climate change opinions. And therefore, the research question I devised is, in the United States and UK, is there a relationship between the tone of coverage of outlets aligned with the major parties that has influenced climate change opinions? And going over the breakdown of my literature review is how I went about it in my paper, pretty much looking at all the variables separately in each country in order to first point out that there are similarities that can make this research valid and statistically significant, but then also allowing me to discover what variables are different in the United States and the UK. So looking at the United States, obviously broken down by climate change media, party polarization, and how those variables interact. The common concepts that I found that were presented through Maxwell and Jules Boykoff is that in the United States, there is that general presence of the overarching idea that climate change is an undisputed, scientifically factual event. However, articles by the Boykoffs, as well as a multitude of other political scientists, discuss the presence of outlier news offering climate change skepticism. And when I go into my content analysis later on, you will see the appearance of skepticism in certain news media outlets. Moving forward into party polarization, this is something that we have discussed a lot in our political science classes and something we see every day. It is obvious and apparent that, as Westphal, Bobin, Chambers, and Judd put it, party polarization in the United States is alarmingly high. And I specifically looked at in my paper why this occurs, and I will further discuss how that kind of ties in to partisanship and polarization in the UK, specifically highlighting how here Noam Lapou puts it, partisanship becomes more apparent as people believe they are perceiving more polarization, which can happen in your personal life, something you see on the news, more diverging between the parties, etc. And as far as tying climate change and party polarization together in the United States, the trend seen with diverging media representations and diverging parties, the same can be said for climate change and party polarization. As these political science put it, roll call votes are always split between parties when it comes to climate change. And when it comes to media representations of climate change, they have become increasingly polarized. Moving forward into the United Kingdom, media representations and party polarization I found in my literature review line up significantly with the United States, specifically with media representations. UK tabloid coverage significantly diverges from the scientific consensus that humans contribute to climate change. And ultimately, the tactic of UK tabloids, such as the one I will point out later on in my content analysis, is diverting focus away from major climate change rhetoric. So instead of talking about what are humans doing to cause climate change, how is climate change occurring today, they're more focused on what is the weather like on a general scale. What are the movement of political actors in regards to climate change? Also bringing up possible downsides to social movements in regards to climate change, as well as the economic sides and downsides to climate change. So ultimately seeing a diversion of focus, which was similar with in the United States. Party polarization is also very clear in the United Kingdom. As Patty Johnston puts it, partisan consistency on British conversation networks drives a degree of ideological divergence. And Johnston also discusses in this piece how conservatives, specifically in the United Kingdom, find themselves to align farther to the right than the Labour Party, and even discusses the more middle ground party of the Liberal Party finding themselves very far to the left from conservatives, but slightly farther to the left than conservatives, my bad, but a little bit farther to the right than the Labour Party. So this idea of party polarization is alive and well in the United Kingdom, just as it is in the United States. However, when we tie the two variables together, we notice a diverging pattern with climate change and party polarization in the UK versus the United States. As Crawley, Coffey, and Chapman so well put it, and I can just say it to you directly, while there is evidence that Labour votes tend to believe climate change is a more serious problem than conservative, is a much smaller gap than between Republican and Democrat supporters in the United States. And this overarching literature review allowed me to create a basis of what my data would be and what my potential results were going to be when conducting this research. So ultimately, my theory, the variables I used were climate change news reporting being the X variable and the climate change opinions based on party affiliation being the Y variable. And some primal hypotheses I reached upon diving into my research was that I found that I was going to find that biased reporting on climate change will not display an influence on polarized climate change opinions across party lines. Additionally, I found that there possibly might be a correlation between Republicans and conservative climate change opinions as far as biased climate change news goes. So ultimately, my theory was prediction bias reporting on climate change news exhibited among partisan news sources will not have an influence on climate change opinions across party lines overall, despite the general polarization between said parties. So my methodology and data, in order to forge this theory and prove it is factual, I needed to utilize two steps. First, I needed to prove that there is prediction bias reporting of climate change with Fox and Daily Mail and compared to their polarized counterparts of CNN and The Guardian, which I will go into later. And then the second part of this data analysis was collecting data on climate change opinions based on the political party. So in order to do that, I collected data from Gallup poll, which gave me a general groundwork of the questions being asked of the surveillance in the US based on their political party. And in order to compare that to the United States, I found several climate change surveys from YouGov UK, which allowed me to find information based on political party. And I located survey questions that parallel with those asked in the US. And from my preliminary content analysis breakdown and data collection breakdown, I came up with these major questions that are going to be present in my step 2 results of data collection, as well as these were the questions I utilized to go about my content analysis. As we can see here, questioning the survey respondents whether climate change is exaggerated, occurring in the present day, has already begun, is human driven, and whether you worry a great deal about climate change. So step 1 in my content analysis of the US, I'm going to be going back and forth slightly here because what I'm going to be trying to prove, what I confidently can say I have proven thus far, is that Fox News and Daily Mail align greatly in how they present climate change news, and CNN and The Guardian themselves also align greatly in how they present climate change news. So overall, first I wanted to look at CNN and The Guardian. Just because this creates a general basis of what we learned in the literature review already, that the groundwork and the tactics utilized in these center left-wing sources is not denying climate change in the slightest, explicitly tackling questions related to climate change, such as the ones I derived to before, such as the human-driven impact of climate change, and not in any means by trying to divert the attention elsewhere. They significantly focused on content that is embolized a proactive tackling of climate change mindset and ultimately creating jarring content overall that catches the eye and allows people to create this call to action mindset where like, hey, I need to do something about climate change. The next point that I want to bring up in my content analysis is probably the most crucial point when we go into the data later on, and that is the comparison of Fox News and Daily Mail. Because what I did want to prove is that there is a relationship between how these news sources biasly report their news sources. So we can see just by the quotes here, the presence of diverting attention elsewhere. Specifically with the Daily Mail, we can see with these quotes here discussing protesters disrupting mining conference, the London police arrest 135 climate change protesters. And going back to Fox News real quick, Fox News, obviously, as we all know, does have a very right-wing sway on climate change. And even though there were countless headlines in Chris Sciaccia's article specifically discussing how we need to target climate change right now, he always proposed this disclaimer note that's pretty much proving the validity of skepticism in discussing climate change. So ultimately, the key takeaways that I took here was that the ultimate constant that proves the bias that is being presented in the Daily Mail and Fox News is the diverting of attention elsewhere. So when we go into my results here, we know that the content analysis displayed predictive bias reporting on climate change through the lens of Fox and Daily Mail, specifically by diverting attention and moderately similar aspect of raising the validity of the opposing view. However, we can see with the results that the UK Conservatives are found to be aligning more with their opposing party as well as United States Democrats. As we can see here, the yellow line is the Conservatives, and we can see that that is falling a lot more in line with Democrats and the UK Labour Party. Therefore, regardless of the bias tactic utilized with climate change reporting, the right wing in the UK is not being influenced by such reporting. So therefore, we can conclude on a grand scale that polarized majority parties may be in fact polarized and likewise gravitate to the news outlet they ideologically align with. But in regards to climate change opinions across the party lines, these opinions are not swayed by the divergent reporting on climate change overall. So then just to go into generally what I discovered from my content analysis and results, prediction bias reporting on climate change across partisan platforms does not have an influence on climate change opinions based on political affiliation. So as we look back at the results here, we obviously see the Republicans in the United States are a major outlier in this data set. So post-examining these climate change opinions, what can explain the stark divide in the US but not in the UK? There are some party system differences between the United States and the United Kingdom, regardless of the major polarization between the two parties, as well as the new evolution of Republicans in the United States that is can be considered starkly different from conservatives in the United Kingdom, as well as the collective action that has been taken in the United Kingdom and Europe together to combat climate change. So this could be proving why United Kingdom conservatives are aligning more and reaching more of a consensus than we are seeing in the Republican Party in the United States. And quickly, just my implications. I'm very passionate about climate change and also noticing how party polarization is it's majorly affecting my personal life. And I'm sure a lot of you guys from being home with Corona and everything and just seeing everyone's alternative opinions. So I wanted to create research that possibly prove that maybe even watching divergent and increasingly right-wing news sources may not have an effect necessarily on your opinion. So can these findings be considered hopeful, and can we learn from the United Kingdom? So ultimately, in regards to climate change, one can conclude from this research that bias reporting in the media is not the key obstacle that diverges climate change opinions in the US based on political affiliation, due to the fact that it does not occur in the United Kingdom. And further research needs to and could be done on why Republicans sway so far to their right side when it comes to climate change opinions. Okay, that's it.
All right, thank you, Maddie. Again, if anyone has a question, you can please put in the chat or use the raise hand function. We need to go a little quickly to stay on schedule here. But so Maddie, when you started this project, we were talking a lot about how we think media systems affect political behavior. And reading these results, it appears as if you think climate change is an issue where the media system is not really affecting political behavior when it comes to climate change opinions?
Yeah. Oh, that was your question. Yeah. At first, when I was beginning this research, I feel like my notion was that media must affect opinion. It must do that. And I'm not saying that it doesn't, because we obviously see that right-wing people that are ideologically going to fall more towards watching Fox News, obviously they are going to be swayed by what they see. But when we see an example such as one from the United Kingdom, where there is increased polarization as we see in the United States, I believe that my research kind of proved that in a case like the United Kingdom that is so similar to ours, they're not being affected by this polarized representation of climate change news. So there are other factors affecting Republicans to believe what they do on climate change in the United States, which would
Yeah, I
offer
think
more research, obviously.
Yeah, I think as you take this to your final paper, I'd like to see think about, why, what is the mechanism there that's leading to this lack of media effect? And I'm
Yeah.
trying to think about how like the partisan media is a pretty old institution in the UK. If you go back to like what we read in Howland and Mancini, like
Yeah.
they've always had a partisan media, and climate change in the US has somewhat recently, because in the 1970s, there wasn't this big divide that has emerged in the last 20 or 30 years. So I'd like you to think about, try to pin down why we see polarized media, but not polarized public opinion across these two countries.
Right. Yeah. Good point.
Are there any other questions for Maddie? All right. Thank you very much, Maddie. For our last presentation, and I know originally on the website I said we'll end at 11:45. We're probably going to end more at about 10 minutes at noon. So sorry if we lose anyone here. But for our last presentation, we have Dylan Teixeira. And Dylan is going to be talking about social media communications from local governments during the pandemic and if they had any sort of effects on citizen behavior.
Thank you. Just gonna get my screen shared up real quick. All right, awesome. Everyone can hear me? Okay. Ooh. So to wrap up the morning, I will now present my research on the effectiveness of social media and social distance messaging. So to begin, we'll take a look at my research question here. How effective is the usage of social media by local governments in communicating responses to crisis situations, particularly in the case of New Jersey local governments during the spread of COVID-19? So before we get into any of my methods or theory, I wanted to touch on the surrounding literature of this topic. First, I'll touch on traditional crisis communication systems and mechanisms used in previous crisis situations. And then I will briefly touch on how COVID-19 has impacted the United States. Then I would like to discuss the government's increased reliance on social media as a means to communicate to citizens. And then lastly, I'd like to discuss the seemingly daily increase of social media usage by the public. So in order to better understand the effectiveness of social media in crisis communication, I sought to look at how the government response was conducted in both the Spanish flu of 1918 and the swine flu of 2009. Definitely some variation in the responses here. The Spanish flu of 1918 was one of the most severe pandemics in recent history, estimated that about 500 million people, or 1/3 of the world's population, became infected. Both vaccines and antibiotics were not yet developed, leaving the United States pretty vulnerable to increased spreading. A large portion of the death toll could definitely be attributed to a lack of a central communication system that was easily and widely accessible to constituents. In terms of national, state, and local pandemic planning, no coordinated pandemic plans existed in 1918. Some cities managed to implement community mitigation measures such as closing schools, banning public gatherings, and issuing isolation or quarantine orders, but the federal government had no centralized role in helping to plan or initiate these interventions. During the swine flu, the US obviously had much more developed preventative systems in place. The access and delivery to communication systems was very similar to what we are experiencing today during COVID. During the swine flu, the government struggled in its crisis communications as too much information was acquired from too many sources. The government struggled to regulate what information was accurate and struggled to distinguish what could harm or hurt the public, especially at the local level. Communications and messaging efforts during the response to the 2009 swine flu focused initially on minimizing transmission, but these transitioned into about vaccination and about the availability and prioritization of getting vaccinated as the vaccine came out. The CDC campaign also focused on providing frequent updates using a consistent set of spokespeople and conducting ongoing research on public understanding about the swine flu. Um, this was done so that these messages could be revised easily for great effectiveness and local accuracy. While I'm sure we are definitely well aware of the impact of COVID-19 by now, I think it's important to discuss as it's very relevant to this research. Like the previously discussed pandemics, COVID-19 has proven to be a deadly disease and seemingly unsolvable problem. The United States has now amounted to 14 million cases and 277,000 deaths, with each number rising by the day. Other literature on the effects of social media during COVID-19 at the international level seeks to describe variation in government responses and determines whether government responses affects the transmission rates of COVID-19. In Hale's variation in COVID-19 government response, she tracks significant variation in both when and how governments respond and urges the governments to adopt an evidence-based approach in their responses. From this, we learn that globally, governments are not practicing the same approaches, and we can see over time that as the virus takes its course, that evidence-based approaches are definitely necessary to tackle this pandemic. I'll now discuss some of the literature surrounding the role of social media in local government crisis communications. Few studies seek to measure these effects locally, but one study indicates that the extent of social media usage is positively associated with local city officials' assessment of their ability to control a crisis situation, as well as their evaluations of the strength of their response. Among 288 analyzed local government officials, results indicated that 71% of government officials use social media during a crisis, while 29% did not. Further, 53% of government officials use Facebook as their preferred means of communication, while 27% use Twitter. The study also indicated that the type of crisis is a determining factor in the government use of social media, with public health crisis as the leading determinant. I feel as though this stresses the significance of how this particular study has not been conducted in the light of COVID-19. While most of the literature centers on the positive values of social media, other authors claim that these benefits come at a price. In a review of social media use in e-government, one study's observations confirm that sustainable success for social media requires a significant change in government culture and resource management. The study finds that new tools are necessary to help both the government and its citizens to develop an understanding of the overwhelming amount of data generated from social media, and describes local government usage of social media as disorganized and unaware of its communications effects on the public. So now, in order to realize the effectiveness of social media, I sought to cover how penetrated social media has become in the United States. When US consumers started spending more time at home during the pandemic, they also started using social media more, providing an unexpected boost to engagement on these platforms. A study conducted between late March and early May found that between 46% and 51% of US adults were using social media more since the outbreak began. In the most recent May 1st study, 51% of total respondents reported increased usage on certain social media platforms. Data on mobile messaging indicates that time spent by US adults will grow by 4 minutes in 2020 to 24 minutes per day, not only due to the pandemic, but also showing strong engagement on messaging services like Facebook Messenger, WhatsApp, and Apple iMessage. This year, US adults will spend 7 more minutes per day on social networks. And from these statistics, we start to notice these trends and pick up on how social media can be used in different ways and how the government seeks to leverage these increases in usage and to really communicate to its citizens. So to test my research question, I've conducted the following study. I first collected Twitter data on all coronavirus-related tweets from the listed official Twitter accounts of New Jersey's 21 counties and both Pennsylvania and Delaware. I then ran a regression of this data against the fluctuating social mobility data using location data from Google's social mobility dataset. This dataset measured the percent changes from baseline levels on the following variables: transit stations, workplaces, parks, residencies, retail stores, and grocery stores. For example, you can see here on the right that in New Jersey, since the start of the pandemic, retail and recreational facilities, including places such as restaurants and shopping centers, have had a significant decrease in public interaction. Grocery stores and pharmacies experience a similar but not as sharp decline. And finally, you can see that a positive 33% change in park interaction compared to the original baseline number. And these are the account handles and examples of some of the tweets. I would use the Twitter advanced search feature and just plug in the keywords of coronavirus, COVID-19, and social distancing, and collected the number of tweets used with those words. So once I had my study collected, I originally had made these predictions. I first hypothesized that when a government account tweets more often, social mobility levels will remain closer to normal baseline levels. From there, I hypothesized that when a government account tweets more often, negative changes will be observed in grocery stores, retail stores, transit stations, and workplaces. And then my last hypothesis was that when a government account tweets more often, positive changes will be observed in parks and residencies. So now I'll get into the regression results. So as you can see here, I ran a multivariable regression. Overall, these results are pretty small and generally insignificant, although one can note the relatively small positive relationship between county tweets and parks. Transit stations, workplaces, residencies, retail stores, and grocery stores exhibited generally insignificant relationships. One thing that I think is worth mentioning is the cross-sectional nature of the test. We're seeing differences in how people in different countries change their behavior. So since these counties are within New Jersey, it doesn't really have that much statistical power. And just some general implications from my research. One of the main takeaways I would consider would be the restrictions on local government. While local government plays an important role, the study shows how hard it is for them to truly make an impact. While there is potential for local governments to influence constituent behavior, they're definitely limited in their functions. And that's only half the battle. Even if local government does reach people, sometimes, as we have especially seen during the pandemic, people's behavior doesn't want to be changed regardless. So that would be it for me.
All right, thank you, Dylan. So the question I have for you is, your study looked at local government social media activity and then the behavior of New Jersey people in different counties. So do you think that how do you think that this relationship between government communications and citizen behavior, do you think it is stronger at the local level, the state, or the national level?
I would definitely say it's strongest at the national level. As I said before, the local level is definitely limited in their function. It doesn't really reach everyone, I would say. But nationally, we're able to provide a concise message that's pretty widespread. And I think people generally get their information from federal sources.
Interesting. Yeah. Yeah. So to study that one, we'd have to have like a multinational study instead of within one state. That is an interesting question that I don't know what I would expect either. For our next question, I'm going to throw it to Professor Bowen.
Hi, Dylan. Interesting data. Can you pull up your regression table one more time?
Yep.
So one thing to think about here is only 21 counties. Your N is really small, and you may not have the statistical power to to do very much with some of these. But like take for example, Model 3, right? So yes, the coefficient isn't twice the size of the standard error, but it's really close. My guess is that's probably pretty close to a p-value of 0.1.
Yeah, it's just over. It was between P1 and P16, if I remember correctly.
It would be even interesting to see what to run a power calculation on that, just to see what kind of n you would have to get.
Yeah,
how big of a sample, because it's just a sample, it's just a data issue there, I think. And so I don't know, just one thing to remember, just that the n is really little. The other thing I guess 2 more points really quick. One, is it possible to make this a time series analysis? Like, do you have a timestamp on the tweets? Could you do it by month? I'd probably Dr. Gallagher told you this. That'd be one way of jacking up that n and getting repeat observations.
Yeah, same thing with the Google data too. You'd have to serialize it and bring it in a number of times.
And then the second thing is, how much is, because I do think there's a relationship here, just not enough information. But is it, can you reflect a little bit on the endogeneity question? Is it that government tweets are driving changing in behavior, or is it some spurious relationship, like how many cases there are that are causing both the tweets and the changes in behavior?
Yep. I would definitely say that when you're looking at behavior, I feel like it has so many influences that it's really tough to get a strong relationship, because it shares so many different values coming in. So that's one thing I would just say in response to that, to the endogeneity question.
Yeah, and if there is a way that you could, like, a really persuasive project like this would be to have over time data, maybe by a month or maybe by 2 weeks, and then you'd have more information, and you could control for changes in amount of cases in the counties too, right? Mm-hmm. So you control for cases, and you could have the media, the tweeting would help you try to isolate some of the differences there.
Yep.
So Dylan, there was one more question from the chat from Matt Bradley. And I kind of fall on the same perspective that Dr. Bowen is doing here, which is that there's probably a little bit more relationship than the regression you've shown here. And I think, he's highlighted a few ways to find it. One would be increasing, the number of observations by a time component, or some other kind of statistical techniques we could use. But so let's say that there is a relationship between government activity and how people behave. Matt's question then is, if that's the case, and we've had pretty consistent messaging since, maybe the summer, why do you think that there's, again, another surge in both cases and mortality happening in New Jersey in recent months?
To answer that, I would definitely, again, talk about the unpredictability of behavior, and perhaps, as time goes by, people will become tired with more restrictions and probably just more worn out. I would say that could just definitely be an influencing factor.
Yeah. So even if the communications are going through, that doesn't mean it's necessarily going to affect behavior.
Yep.
I think there's a kernel of truth in that. I also think that just in general, the communications aren't as strong this fall as they were in the spring. I think that there was a lot of uncertainty in the spring, and government sent a pretty clear signal that they want people to change behavior. And as we've gotten to the fall, it's more been a series of suggestions and guidelines that are not quite as urgent. And I appreciate your historical perspective here, looking at the prior pandemic and health crises to show how these things vary over time, both government response and citizen behavior change. All right, thank you. Well, that will wrap it up, everyone. I recorded this meeting, so I will have it posted on the Peers website. The Peers website also that as of this morning, there's a few more video presentations being added throughout the day. I also have done an overview of the class in general because I have 5 or 6 students that are still furiously putting their final presentations together, and I wanted to mention what they were working on for the what I'm sure will be heavy traffic to the Peers website in the years to come. So thank you all for coming. I really appreciate your questions. Nice work to all the presenters. And I hope that everyone has a good last week of the semester as we get ready for final exams. So thank you all for coming, and we'll see you.